The first thing you need to understand is what the jawbone looked like when they took it out. In 1857, a surgeon in New York named James Rushmore Wood published an account of an operation he had performed on a 16-year-old girl named Cornelia. She had worked 8 hours a day in the packing department of a match factory for 2.5 years. The pain had started as a toothache. Then the gums swelled. Then the swelling became an abscess that would not heal. Then the abscess opened into a fistula, a channel burrowing from the inside of her mouth through the bone and out through the skin of her face. The bone beneath was dying. It was turning porous, spongy, light as chalk, separating from the living bone around it in chunks that the surgeons called sequestra, dead islands floating in a sea of infection. The smell of the rotting tissue was so overpowering that Cornelia's family could not stay in the same room with her. Wood removed her entire lower jaw. He used a surgical instrument he described as something resembling a cheese wire. The first operation was not successful. He had to perform a second. He monitored her for a month before he declared her cured. She was 16 years old. She had been making matches. The disease that ate her jaw had a name. They called it phossy jaw. It had been documented since 1838. It would not be banned until 1910. For 72 years, the governments of the industrialized world knew exactly what was happening to the women and girls who made matches, and they did not stop it because matches were cheap, and the women who made them were cheaper. A match is a simple thing: a wooden splint, a head of combustible material, a striking surface. Before 1826, there were no friction matches at all. People lit fires with flint and steel, or with slow-burning tapers called spills, or they carried embers from one fire to the next. The friction match was invented in 1826 by the English chemist John Walker. He discovered that a mixture of antimony sulfide and potassium chlorate, when dried on the tip of a wooden stick and scraped against a rough surface, would ignite. Walker's matches were crude, unreliable, and expensive. The breakthrough came in the 1830s when manufacturers discovered that white phosphorus, a wax translucent chemical element that ignites at extremely low temperatures, could be mixed into the match head compound to create a match that would strike on any surface. The Strike Anywhere match, the Lucifer match, the match that changed the world. By the 1840s, match factories had sprung up across England, France, Germany, Austria, Sweden, and the United States, and the white phosphorus match had become one of the most ubiquitous consumer products on Earth. Every home needed matches, every tavern, every shop, every workshop, every church, every ship. The demand was insatiable. The supply required an army of workers, and the workers were overwhelmingly women and girls because matchmaking was classified as light work. Light work meant low pay, and poorly paid work was women's work. Women's work did not require safety precautions because women were considered disposable in exactly the same way that their labor was considered insignificant. The process of making a match was this. The raw materials arrived at the factory as blocks of wood, typically poplar or aspen, soft woods that split cleanly. Machines called splint cutters shaved the blocks into thin rectangular sticks, thousands per hour, and these sticks were sorted by hand and arranged in metal frames, hundreds at a time, their tips protruding in a uniform row. The frames were carried to the dipping room. A worker called a dipper lifted a frame and dipped the exposed tips into a heated vat of matchhead composition, a paste containing white phosphorus, glue, potassium chlorate, ground glass, and other binding agents. The paste was warm, kept at a temperature that made it flow easily, and the warmth accelerated the release of phosphorus vapor into the air. The dipper held the frame over the vat while the excess paste dripped off. The dipper then carried the frame to a drying rack in a heated chamber where the match heads hardened. The dippers were almost always men or older boys because the frames were heavy and the work was physically demanding, but the dippers were only a fraction of the workforce. Behind them stood the fillers, the rollers off, the boxers, the labelers, and the packers, nearly all of them women and girls, some as young as 12, some as young as 9 in the earlier decades of the industry. The fillers took the dried matches from the frames and placed them into boxes. The rollers off arranged the matches in neat rows inside the boxes. The boxers wrapped and sealed the finished product. These women and girls worked in the same rooms as the dippers, breathing the same air, touching matches whose heads were coated in white phosphorus, handling the product with bare hands all day long. And then there were the home workers. Bryant and May and other match companies employed armies of women who worked at home, making the match boxes themselves. They were paid by the piece, 2.5 pence per gross of boxes, and they worked in their kitchens and living rooms, cutting and folding and gluing cardboard while their children played on the floor beside them. The phosphorus did not stay in the factory. It went home with the workers on their clothing, on their hands, in their hair. It contaminated the homes where they lived and the rooms where their children slept. The entire East End of London smelled of phosphorus during the decades when the match factories were running at full production. The dipping room was small, enclosed, and poorly ventilated because ventilation cooled the paste and made it harder to work with, and because nobody had invested in exhaust systems for a room full of women making matches at £1 a day. The phosphorus vapor accumulated in the air of the dipping room throughout the working day. It settled on the workers' skin, in their hair, on their clothing. It infiltrated their food if they ate in the workroom, which they did because there was no separate eating area. At Bryant and May, the special rules introduced in 1893 mandated that meals be taken in a separate room. The company resisted. The workers ate where they worked. Their bread and cheese sat on benches next to frames of phosphorus-tipped matches, their hands unwashed because there were no washing facilities. The air they breathed while eating was the same air that was slowly killing them. The factory itself sometimes glowed. Workers described a bluish-green luminescence on the walls and floors of the dipping room at the end of the shift, when the lights were turned down and the phosphorus dust that had settled on every surface during the day became visible. Workers went home with clothes that glowed in the dark. One account describes a woman walking home through the streets of Bow at night with a faint halo of phosphorescence around her skirt. The phosphorus was everywhere. It was in the air, on the surfaces, on the skin, in the lungs, and in the mouths of the people who spent their lives inside the factory. White phosphorus is toxic to bone. It is specifically and preferentially toxic to the jawbone, for reasons that were not fully understood until the 20th century, but were observed with devastating clarity from the 1830s onward. The jawbone has a rich blood supply and a high rate of metabolic activity because it is constantly remodeling in response to the mechanical forces of chewing. This makes it particularly vulnerable to any substance that disrupts bone metabolism. White phosphorus does exactly that. It interferes with the osteoblasts, the cells that build new bone, and it damages the blood vessels that supply the jaw. The result is necrosis. The bone dies while the person is still alive. The first symptom is a toothache. It begins in one tooth, then spreads to the neighboring teeth and to the jawbone itself. The pain is persistent and progressive. The gums swell. Abscesses form in the tissue around the affected teeth. The abscesses do not heal. They open into fistulae that drain pus through the gum and sometimes through the skin of the face. The teeth loosen and fall out. After approximately 3 months of exposure, the bone begins to separate from the surrounding living tissue, forming sequestra, chunks of dead bone that sit in pockets of infection inside the jaw. After 6 months, the necrosis is extensive. The lower jaw is more commonly affected than the upper, and in severe cases the entire mandible is destroyed. The dead bone, when examined at surgery or autopsy, is porous and lightweight, and it exhibits one final grotesque characteristic. It glows. The affected bone and the tissue around it emit a faint greenish-white phosphorescence in the dark. The gums glow. The breath glows. Newspaper accounts from the 1890s describe patients whose faces could be seen glowing in a darkened room, the light coming from inside their own skulls. The condition was sometimes called matchmaker's leprosy, and the comparison was not casual. The victims of phossy jaw were ostracized in exactly the way that lepers had been ostracized for centuries. The smell of the necrotic tissue and the drainage was so foul that family members could not remain in the same room with the patient. The pus that drained from the fistula in the face was constant, soaking through bandages, staining clothing, and producing an odor that followed the victim everywhere. Eating became impossible as teeth fell out and the jaw disintegrated. Some patients could only consume liquid diets for the rest of their lives. The victims' nutrition collapsed. Their immune systems, already damaged by the phosphorus, could not fight the chronic infection. Aspiration of the toxic drainage caused phosphorus bronchopneumonia. Seizures occurred, a condition the doctors called phossy brain. The bone marrow was damaged throughout the body, a condition called phossy marrow. The eye could atrophy if the upper jaw was affected, and the infection spread to the orbit, producing permanent blindness in one eye or both. Spontaneous fractures of the femur, tibia, and clavicle could occur in advanced cases as the phosphorus destroyed bone density throughout the skeleton. A Belgian physician documented 30 cases of long bone fractures in men with phosphorus necrosis of the jaw over a 20-year period. The disease did not stay in the face. It moved through the body like an invading army, breaking down one system after another until the patient died of organ failure, infection, or starvation. The treatment was surgery, and the surgery was mutilation. The affected bone had to be cut out. In early cases, a section of the jaws could be removed and the patient could survive with a partially functional face. In advanced cases, the entire mandible was removed, leaving the patient with no lower jaw, unable to chew, unable to speak clearly, unable to close the mouth, the tongue hanging unsupported in a cavity that had once been a face. Some patients underwent 5, 6, 7 operations as the necrosis spread from one section of bone to the next, each surgery removing more of the jaw, each recovery incomplete because the phosphorus exposure continued as long as the patient continued to work. And most patients continued to work because they had no other source of income and no system of compensation for the disease that had destroyed them. Without surgery, phossy jaw was frequently fatal. With surgery, it was survivable, but devastating. Dr. Wood's operation on 16-year-old Cornelia required a second attempt and a month of monitoring. Annie, who was 13, underwent jaw removal and survived. Maggie, who was 23, had 5 operations and went back to work at the factory between each one because the alternative to working in the factory that was eating her face was starvation, and starvation kills faster than phosphorus. A review of case records from Zurich covering the period 1867 to 1889 showed that the majority of phossy jaw patients were women, and that the mean age at diagnosis was in the 20s and 30s, though cases in teenagers were common. Approximately 11% of those exposed to white phosphorus fumes developed phossy jaw, on average about 5 years after initial exposure. This meant that a woman who started working in a match factory at 14 might not show symptoms until she was 19. By then she had been breathing the vapor for 5 years. The damage was already extensive, and the disease, once it began, could not be reversed. The phosphorus was in the bone. It would stay in the bone. The bone would die. The only question was, how much of the jaw would be gone before the patient either left the factory, had it cut out, or died. The first case of phossy jaw was diagnosed in 1838 in Vienna by a doctor named Friedrich Wilhelm Lorenzer. The patient was a female matchstick maker who had been exposed to phosphorus vapors over a 5-year period. By 1844, Lorenzer had documented 22 cases and had established the toxic effects of white phosphorus beyond any reasonable doubt. In England, Charles Dickens wrote about phossy jaw in his journal Household Words as early as 1852. The disease was not obscure. It was not hidden. It was described, named, published, discussed in medical journals and popular magazines and parliamentary debates across Europe for decades. The cause was known. The prevention was known. Red phosphorus, a chemically stable allotrope of the same element, could be used instead of white phosphorus to make matches that struck on a prepared surface rather than on any surface. Safety matches using red phosphorus had been commercially available since the 1850s. They worked. They did not produce toxic vapor. They did not cause phossy jaw. The only reason white phosphorus continued to be used was that it was cheaper, and it produced a match that would strike anywhere, which consumers preferred. The match industry argued that switching to red phosphorus would increase costs, reduce competitiveness, and drive the export trade into the hands of foreign manufacturers who faced no such restriction. The governments of Europe and America listened to this argument and accepted it for 72 years while women's jawbones rotted inside their faces. At Bryant and May's Fairfield Works in Bow, in the East End of London, the match factory was one of the most significant employers in the district. The building covered acres of land. Several thousand workers passed through its gates every morning. Most of them were young women and teenage girls, many of them Irish immigrants, and most of them came from the surrounding slums of Bow, Bromley, and Poplar. They worked 14-hour days starting at 6:30 in the morning in summer and 8 in the morning in winter, and finishing at 6 in the evening. Their wages averaged 11 shillings per week for women and less for girls. From those wages, the company deducted fines for offenses that would have been comical if they were not so cruel. They were fined 3 pence for talking, 3 pence for dropping matches, 3 pence for having dirty feet, up to a shilling for an untidy workbench, a half-day's pay for arriving late, and fines for going to the toilet without permission. The fines were imposed at the discretion of the foreman, men who had unchecked power over the women they supervised, and who used that power to control, humiliate, and steal from workers who had no recourse and no representation. The foreman prevented complaints from reaching management, which meant management could claim ignorance of the conditions. Management did claim ignorance repeatedly when questioned by factory inspectors and members of parliament. Meanwhile, the company's shareholders were receiving dividends of over 20%. Theodore Bryant, one of the company's principals, had recently used company profits to erect a statue of William Gladstone in the East End and to purchase a public park. These acts of philanthropy were funded by the labor of women whose wages were being docked for going to the toilet. The girls who carried frames of matches on their heads developed bald patches where the friction wore the hair away. 15-year-old girls with bald scalps and 11 shillings a week and phosphorus in their lungs. That was the workforce of the most profitable match company in Britain. The girls were, in Annie Besant's words, undersized because underfed. Many of them had started working as children and had never been adequately nourished. Their growth was stunted. Their teeth were bad, which was particularly unfortunate because bad teeth, teeth with cavities or weakened roots, provided a direct pathway for the phosphorus to reach the jawbone. The disease entered through the mouth. A decayed tooth was an open door. The women who had the worst teeth got phossy jaw first, and the women who had the worst teeth were the women who had grown up in the worst poverty. That meant that phossy jaw was not merely an occupational disease. It was a disease of class. It selected for the poorest and the most vulnerable, and it destroyed them with a precision that felt, to the people who studied it, almost deliberate. The workers ate their meals in the workrooms where they handled phosphorus because there was no separate eating area. Their food was contaminated with phosphorus particles from their hands, their clothing, and the air. Some workers' hands glowed in the dark. A 13-year-old girl named Annie noticed that her hands had begun to glow after 4 years in the factory. She underwent jaw removal surgery. A 23-year-old named Maggie continued to work in the factory after Fitz operations to remove sections of her jaw. It was estimated that approximately 11% of those exposed to white phosphorus fumes developed phossy jaw, though the actual figure was almost certainly higher because the company actively suppressed reporting. In 1892, it was documented that Bryant and May docked the wages of workers who went to the hospital for treatment instead of seeing the company doctor, a practice designed to prevent the workers from receiving independent medical attention that might result in their cases being reported to the authorities. Bryant and May were fined in 1898 for failing to report 17 cases of phosphorus poisoning to the factory inspectors, despite assurances that their workforce was healthy and unaffected. A separate manufacturer, Moreland and Sons, was fined in 1894 for the same offense. The fines and costs to Bryant and May amounted to £25 and 9 shillings. That was the price the British legal system placed on 17 women's rotting jawbones. 23% dividends on one side of the ledger, £25 on the other. The math was clear. On June 23, 1888, Annie Besant, a socialist and women's rights campaigner, published an article in her weekly newspaper, The Link. The article was titled, "White Slavery in London." Besant had stood outside the gates of the Bryant and May factory and spoken to the workers as they left after their shift. What she heard became the most famous exposé of industrial working conditions in Victorian England. The article was deliberately incendiary. Besant wanted Bryant and May to sue her for libel, because a libel trial would force the company to disprove her claims in open court, which they could not do because her claims were true. Instead, the company tried a different strategy. Management ordered the workers to sign a document stating that the conditions described in Besant's article were lies. The workers refused. The company then fired a worker they suspected of having spoken to Besant, using another pretext. On July 5, 1888, 1,400 women and girls walked out of the Bryant and May factory and did not go back. The Match Girls' strike of 1888 lasted 3 weeks. The strikers held mass meetings on Mile End Waste. They marched to Parliament. They met with members of the House of Commons. Annie Besant used her newspaper to solicit donations for the strike fund. Emmeline Pankhurst, the suffrage leader, threw herself into the cause. William Stead, the crusading editor, publicized the strike in the national press. The public responded. People stopped buying Bryant and May matches. After 3 weeks, the company capitulated. The fines were abolished. The dismissed worker was rehired. Grievances could now be taken directly to management without going through the foreman, and meals were to be taken in a separate room where the food would not be contaminated with phosphorus. The Union of Women Match Workers was formed on July 27, 1888, with Besant as secretary. It was the largest union of women and girls in the country. Sarah Chapman, one of the 3 workers who had been in the deputation to management, was elected to the Union Committee and became its first representative to the Trades Union Congress. The strike won the immediate demands. It did not end the use of white phosphorus. The matches continued to be made the same way, with the same poison, in the same rooms, with the same results. What the strike did accomplish was larger. It proved that unskilled workers, the lowest and most exploitable class of labor in the industrial economy, could organize, could strike, and could win. The Match Girls' strike inspired the Great Dock Strike of 1889, in which dockers in the East End walked out for better wages and conditions and won. Many of the dockers were fathers, brothers, and husbands of the Match Girls. The wave of organizing that followed became known as New Unionism, the movement that brought collective bargaining to the unskilled working class for the first time. The 1,400 women and girls who walked out of a match factory in Bow changed the trajectory of labor history in Britain, and they did it while their jawbones were rotting from the inside. The ban came slowly. Finland, then part of the Russian Empire, was first in 1872. Denmark followed in 1874, France in 1897. Sweden, which had its own match industry and had pioneered the safety match using red phosphorus in the 1850s, had never allowed white phosphorus in domestic production. which proved that an entire national match industry could operate profitably without poisoning its workers. The Swedish safety match was struck on a specially prepared surface on the side of the box rather than on any surface, and this was considered a disadvantage by consumers who wanted to be able to strike a match on their boot or on a wall or on whatever was at hand. Consumer preference for a more convenient match that killed the women who made it over a safer match that required a striking surface was one of the reasons the ban took so long. The market wanted what the market wanted, and what the market wanted was a match that lit anywhere, and the cost of that convenience was measured in jawbones. In 1891, William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, opened a match factory in Old Ford, East London, that used only red phosphorus. His workers were paid twice what Bryant and May paid theirs. He produced 6 million boxes a year. He called them Lights in Darkest England, a deliberate echo of Henry Morton Stanley's famous book about Africa, turned back on British society to suggest that the real darkness was at home, in the factories of the East End. He organized tours of his factory for members of Parliament and journalists, and then took them to the homes of the sweated workers who made matches for Bryant and May, so they could see the difference between a factory that chose not to poison its workers and a factory that chose to continue. The publicity worked, slowly. In 1893, the British government introduced special rules for the 22 Lucifer match factories in England, mandating certification, sanitation, ventilation, and medical examinations. The factories objected. They said the rules were disruptive and the medical examinations were costly. Bryant and May continued to use white phosphorus. In 1898, newspaper investigations exposed the company's systematic concealment of phossy jaw cases. Bryant and May were prosecuted for failing to report 17 cases of phosphorus poisoning. The fines amounted to £25. In 1901, under the weight of sustained public pressure, Bryant and May finally stopped using white phosphorus. In 1906, an international conference at Bern, Switzerland, produced a treaty pledging to prohibit the manufacture, importation, and sale of white phosphorus matches. It was the first international agreement to ban an industrial product. Britain passed the White Phosphorus Matches Prohibition Act in 1908, effective January 1, 1910. The United States characteristically did not ban white phosphorus outright. The American match industry argued that a ban would be unconstitutional, an interference with commerce, a violation of the rights of manufacturers to produce a legal product. Instead, in 1912, Congress placed a punitive tax on white phosphorus matches, 2 cents per 100 matches, a rate so high that manufacturing them became economically impossible. It was a ban disguised as a tax, the kind of legislative sleight of hand that American government uses when it wants to prohibit something without admitting that it is prohibiting it. The American Association for Labor Legislation, led by its secretary John B. Andrews, had campaigned for years to eliminate white phosphorus matches, documenting over 100 cases of phossy jaw in the United States alone by 1909. The Diamond Match Company, the largest American match manufacturer, had even developed a substitute formula using sesquisulfide of phosphorus and had offered to release its patent to the public in 1910. The technology to make matches without poisoning the workers had existed for over 60 years. It took 87 years to implement it globally. India and Japan banned white phosphorus in 1919. China banned it in 1925. From the first documented case in 1838 to the last major ban in 1925, 87 years passed. 87 years during which the cause of the disease was known, the prevention was known, the alternative was available, and the women kept dying anyway because the white phosphorus match was cheaper to produce and more convenient for the consumer, and the women who made it were poor and young and female and Irish and expendable, and their jawbones were not worth the cost of switching to a safer chemical. The math was done. The math was always done. The jawbones lost. They always lost. The match factory is closed now, Bryant and May's Fairfield Works in Bow was converted into luxury apartments in the 1990s. The building is called Bow Quarter. The apartments sell for over £500,000. There is a blue plaque on the wall, unveiled in 2022 by English Heritage, commemorating the Match Girls' strike of 1888. The plaque does not mention phossy jaw. It does not mention Cornelia, who was 16, or Annie, who was 13, or Maggie, who was 23 and still working after 5 operations. It does not mention the glow, the greenish-white phosphorescence that came from inside the mouths of the women who made the matches that lit every home in the British Empire, a glow that could be seen in a darkened room, coming from the place where their jawbones used to be. The matches are gone. The phosphorus is gone. The glow in the dark is gone. The women who carried it are in the ground, most of them in unmarked graves in East London cemeteries, their names recorded nowhere. Their suffering measured in nothing more permanent than a fine of £25 imposed on a company that paid 23% dividends to its shareholders while its workers' faces fell apart. If this is the kind of history that stays with you, subscribe. There are more machines like this one, and every one of them left a body count the world forgot.